Here to check out the statue within the Temple of Zeus. And there we're completely in the dark. We don't have any physical evidence, and we're going to have to do some serious investigation and try to figure out how to flesh out the statue.
Mark has enlisted the help of Judy Barringer. A doctor of archaeology, Judy is an authority on Olympia. It was the site of the ancient Olympic Games, which began in 776 BC. And it had enormous cultural importance. Across more than 50 acres, there are running tracks, swimming pools, gymnasiums, and temples. Everything needed for the most important athletic event in the ancient world. And the games were held in honor of Zeus.
The games, like all of these athletic games, were not just athletic events, but were given or made in honor of a god. And here it was the god Zeus. So we're in a religious sanctuary. We're not just at an athletic place.
The statue was housed in the Temple of Zeus. The temple was built in 456 BC and destroyed by an earthquake in the 5th century AD.
So here we are, Mark, at the Temple of Zeus. This was the largest temple on the site, the most important structure on the site. The ancient visitor would have made offerings to the god Zeus outside the temple, come in, perhaps looked inside to see the statue.
The remains of the enormous external columns reveal how the temple exterior might have looked.
Oh, wow. That is good.
Pretty amazing, isn't it?
Okay, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns parallel to one another that have toppled over.
The drums laid out like dominoes.
Right.
And then we can see the capitals at the end. What do you think would cause such a pattern? It's quite remarkable.
One of the explanations that has been given are effects of earthquakes.
Yeah.
If the columns were still tied together when this effect happened, with a set of beams that are holding it together, and the beams went over in one direction, the columns have to go together with it.
Okay, all right. Okay?
The beauty here is that the direction is so perfectly aligned one to the other, and the shearing effect of the drums. That's a really beautiful picture.
Mark measures the perfectly preserved columns to try and determine the height of the statue.
51 centimeters, 71, 55 centimeters, 64, and that one's about 78.
Greek historian Pausanias put the temple at over 60 feet tall, and Mark's calculations confirm this. By measuring the spaces between the exterior columns on each side, we know that the length of the temple was 220 feet, and there were more columns inside.
And these columns were at least 1 story, perhaps 2 stories high. And we would have had this enormous, colossal statue of Zeus in front of us, right here.
Okay, so this is the reason why we're here.
Exactly. This is the wonder, this is the reason for the temple's existence, is to house a cult statue.
Mark still needs to know what the statue looked like. There's very little to go on except contemporary accounts. One ancient author puts the height of the statue at 40 feet, and Strabo added that if Zeus moved to stand up, he would unroof the temple. These accounts are in keeping with Mark's calculations from the height of the columns. They also tell us who built the statue. A sculptor called Phidias had already claimed his place in history, creating another statue at the Acropolis in Athens. We also know where he built the statue, thanks to an extraordinary find. A cup inscribed with Phidias' name. It's evidence that this, the location of the find, was his workshop. Today, remains of a later Christian church dominate the site.
So, Mark, this is Phidias' workshop.
Okay, this is where they would have built the statue of Zeus.
That's right. It's the exterior walls of the lower courses and some columns in the center that would have been here, and the statue is built between those columns just to see if this is going to fit into that structure.
The size and proportions of Phidias' workshop were identical to the space the statue was intended to occupy.
When the statue was made and put in place 1 year after the temple was made, it had to work. It had to be perfect because everything was so perfect about the temple itself. You couldn't take that statue in if you didn't know it was going to work.
Marx noticed something else about the workshop. It seems to have the same orientation as the temple. To find out if this was deliberate, he takes a couple of readings.
Okay, so try to take a bearing off this wall. I read about 79 degrees here. That's bang, wow. Okay, I'm reading a tad below 80 degrees, something like that.
The results are astonishing. The workshop and temple are aligned precisely.
The differences we got were so minute that it couldn't be left to chance. From my point of view, I'd like to believe it had something to do with the light.
Mark believes that to have gone to so much trouble to recreate the conditions of the temple, sunlight must have played a big part in Phidias's design. But he still needs to know how Zeus was constructed. We know that the statue of Zeus was not made from stone, but its skin fashioned from ivory, and his robes and sandals from gold. At the time, only Phidias was creating statues from these materials, and the craftsmanship they required was masterful. These molds found in his workshop may have been used to cast the gold robes, and found alongside the molds were these small chips of ivory.
I'd like to try to get a feel for how they might have tried to make the ivory skin. How are they going to get sheets of ivory on the elephant?
You would shave it off in layers, much as you might do sharpening a pencil, so it's coming off in a layer.
How would they be softened? Because I know the elephant tusk is quite hard.
The speculation is that the Greeks soaked the ivory in vinegar for some period of time until it becomes malleable.
Once they had the softened piece of ivory, they could put it in a mold.
That's right. The ivory would take the shape of the mold, where then it would dry, presumably retain the shape of the mold.
But even the largest elephant tusk would only yield a relatively small piece of ivory, and the statue of Zeus was colossal, over 40 feet tall.
What's going to give this entire jigsaw puzzle, what's put together, some structural stability?
We know, by analogy with Phidias' earlier creation, the statue of Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon, also this colossus of ivory and gold, we know that it was held up by a wooden and perhaps metal armature, and so we can assume the same was true for the later Phidian Zeus.
And there's evidence that Phidias didn't rely on size alone to make his statue impressive. After noting the identical orientation of the temple and the workshop, Mark believes that lighting was hugely important. Back at the site, the evidence on the ground shows that Phidias was using every trick in the book to add drama to his great statue. The stone used to build the temple was a local Shelly limestone, gray and dull. So to lift the interior of the temple and maximize light, it was coated in plaster.
They would have used painted plaster, white painted plaster on the exterior to imitate marble. And we actually have some plaster remaining here on the surface. You can see a good piece of it right here.
This plaster may look dull and yellow now, but when the temple was built, it would have been a brilliant white, reflecting the light and making the columns radiant. And Phidias had another trick up his sleeve. With the only source of natural light in the temple, the one huge door, he designed a feature to make the most of this light. Standing directly in front of the statue was a reflecting pool, and 2,500 years later, we can still see the evidence.
Run your fingers alongside of this, you can feel a channel here.
Yeah.
And you can trace that line not only on this side, but on the opposite side as well, at exactly the same point. And this seems to mark a water line, where water or liquid was.
So what you're saying is we had about 5 or 6 centimeters of fluid in it.
The dramatic reflections created by the pool were coupled with the opulence of the ivory and gold that made up the body of Zeus. Surrounded by the brilliant white columns of the temple, it would have made an awe-inspiring sight. In Zeus's hands, he held a scepter as an emblem of his power, and a winged figure of Nike or victory. Lit by torches and fires, the temple would have been a spectacular sight.
We certainly do see incredibly ornate structure and statues that make up the temple itself. Everything made the temple so beautiful, and yet the temple is not what we're here for. It was the statue of Zeus. So the size and the dimensions of the statue compared to the size and beauty and dimensions of the building must have been incredibly beautiful in order to make that one of the seven wonders and not the temple and not together.
The seven wonders have captivated man's imagination since they were first created. Of the seven, the Great Pyramid is the only one that survived. But what led to the destruction of the other wonders? And why have they continued to fascinate us to this day? They have been held up as things of near perfection, as the very greatest products of the classical world, setting a standard against which future achievements would be judged and found wanting. But in their time, the seven wonders marked the start of a revolution, a time when man would reach out and stamp authority on the world he inhabited, defy nature and become its master. The scale of the pyramid, the pharaohs, and the mausoleum, the cutting-edge technology of the Colossus and the Temple of Artemis, the taming of nature that created the Hanging Gardens, and the dream that created a towering ivory statue of Zeus. Each one was symbolic of a new boldness, but each also revealed man's weaknesses, his arrogance. Both tombs, the Great Pyramid of Giza and the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, were bits to achieve immortality. The mausoleum was an attempt by a king to have his name remembered by creating the most ornate tomb the world had ever seen.
For me, the most important thing about the mausoleum is that it was built for this ruler, Mausolus. It was all about this one king's legacy.
But his work was in vain. Although it survived until the 15th century, earthquakes caused serious damage, and as with the fate of many great monuments, its stonework was plundered, incorporated into a crusader's castle. These people cared nothing for King Mausolus's legacy. Not content to take just the stonework from the mausoleum, most of the magnificent statues that surrounded the tomb were destroyed too, burnt for lime mortar. The word mausoleum lives on, but few know of its origins. Similarly, although the Great Pyramid is recognized the world over, how many know it was a tomb for the pharaoh Khufu? Man's attempt to create and worship gods fared no better. The two larger-than-life statues, the bronze Colossus and the statue of Zeus crafted from gold and ivory, were without a doubt fine examples of skill and dedication. The Colossus would have been visible for miles.
The effect that it would have had on the whole island and even the surrounding sea must have been incredible. As you approached Rhodes by boat, first thing perhaps that you would have seen was the solar crown and head of the god peering over the horizon.
The Colossus was the biggest bronze statue ever built, but it lasted just 54 short years.
With Colossus, we look at the connection between bronze, rock, and iron. And the connection between the three, while was able to stand 60 years of gale force winds possibly, couldn't take the full brunt that Earth could throw at it.
Like the Temple of Artemis and the pharaohs, the Colossus was brought down by an earthquake. It was never repaired, as an oracle foretold that if the Colossus was rebuilt, Rhodes would suffer great misfortune. For 900 years, its remains lay untouched, a symbol of man's overreaching ambition. The statue of Zeus survived longer, just as beautiful, just as extraordinary.
Must have been something to look at. The materials they used must have been incredibly beautiful.
Along with the Temple of Artemis and the Mausoleum, its destruction came about through the advent of Christianity. When the Christian Church had all pagan ceremonies banned in 391 AD, Olympia, home of the statue, fell into disrepair. The statue was taken from its holy shrine to Constantinople for the Christian Emperor Theodosius. Once a wonder of the world, the magnificent ivory Zeus and become little more than a trophy. Before Christianity, the Temple of Artemis was one of the most visited shrines in the world. The magnificence of the temple reflected its status.
It was the only temple made from marble of its size and of its type in the whole of the known world. It was the temple to really finish and begin all temples. The Parthenon would have been kicked into the sea in comparison. That's just the building, the structure alone, which was a marvel. Because then inside was this extraordinary cult goddess who was appealing, it seems to me, to absolutely everything before the Christians came along.
The temple
Fucking kidding me?
disasters, being rebuilt after an arson attack, and again after being sacked by the gods. What it couldn't survive was a changing world. By the 4th century, the cult goddess no longer drew the crowds.
What the fuck, man?
Had a stronger pull. So when the temple was damaged by an earthquake, there was no call to rebuild it. For all its grandeur, even the pharaohs couldn't survive change.
Oh well, I'm dead.
Ptolemy, the ruler of Alexandria, believed his city the greatest that civilization had ever known. When he demanded a beacon to guide ships into its harbor, no ordinary lighthouse would do. Instead, he built the Pharos. And only the Great Pyramid was taller.
Everything we know
Oh, brother.
warrants its position as a wonder of the world.
But as the city's position in the world slipped, so the Pharos lost its shine.
Ooh, more money. What can I possibly do with it? Absolutely nothing.
Before being destroyed
So
in an earthquake
gay.
in 1375. Perhaps it's to be expected that the one wonder of which there is no trace is the one closest to nature. The hanging gardens of Babylon were man's attempt at taming the earth. But the arrogance, a tropical oasis in the middle of the desert. It would have been a constant battle to prevent nature from reclaiming its land. Inevitably, the fight was lost.